Welcome to session 15 of the Thomson Rogers webinar series. My name is Sarah Naiman and I'm an associate here at Thomson Rogers. I will be your host for today's seminar, The Legal Implications of Virtual Treatments and Assessments. This topic was suggested by one of our viewers and is no doubt very timely and important. Our speakers today are Michael Bennett and special guest, Dr. Brian Levitt. Michael Bennett is a partner here at Thomson Rogers. Michael has extensive experience with psychiatric and psychological claims. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Levitt here with us today. Dr. Levitt is a partner at Kaplan and Levin Psychologists. He has performed hundreds of psychological legal assessments in relation to MVA, WSIB, and other personal injury contexts. Dr. Levitt has served on the Ontario Psychological Association Subcommittee on Auto Insurance since 2004. He is currently involved in the Ontario Psychological Association's development of guidelines for best practices in psychological remote teleassessments, consulting as part of the legal assessment subgroup. He has given numerous presentations on psychological legal assessment, including workshops on understanding and carrying out catastrophic impairment assessments. He has also testified as an expert witness in trials, arbitrations, and tribunals, and has been asked by the College of Psychologists of Ontario to provide expert opinion regarding complaints made against psychologists. Before we start today, we'd like to remind everyone that we are continuing our prize draw this year and will offer one $50 Everything card to a lucky winner at each session. The Everything card is a gift card that you can redeem at almost any place you can think of. At the end of today's session, we'll pick a random number and correspond it to the order number in which you registered for this webinar. Be sure to stay until the very end to find out who the winner is, because it could be you. Regarding the Q&A, if you have any questions, we ask that you please submit them using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to all of your questions at the end of the presentation. Michael and Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. I'm Michael Bennett, and today's webinar topic is on virtual assessments and treatment. Since the pandemic, many of us have been forced to utilize new technology to serve our patients, our clients, whether we've liked it or not. Virtual softwares like Zoom, WebEx, MedEx have been lifesavers through this very difficult time. Our ability to reach out to those who can't leave their homes and continue their rehab goals has been one of the silver linings of this pandemic. In fact, these virtual platforms have worked so well, it has made many of us wonder what role virtual assessments and treatment will play even after the pandemic is long gone. Who among us hasn't marveled at the efficacy and potential of the virtual platform in the future to reach those we haven't been able to reach out to in the past? One group that has gone ahead of this curve is the Ontario Psychological Association. And along with the Canadian Association of Psychologists in Disability Assessment, they struck up a working group of psychologists to prepare a guidelines for best practices in psychological remote assessments. And as you can see by the slide in front of you, this is just version 1. We are fortunate to have one of the esteemed members of this working group here today, Dr. Brian Levitt. And he's been nice enough to come here and discuss some of the findings of the Ontario Psychological Association in this regard. Thank you, Dr. Levitt, for being here today.
Thank you.
By way of background, Dr. Levitt, maybe you could just tell us a bit about the landscape for virtual assessments and treatment before the pandemic hit us.
Yeah, I think that before the pandemic hit, there were a number of us who actually were using virtual assessment for both virtual methods, both treatment and assessment. I know at our practice, we've been doing it for years, especially in situations where someone cannot leave their home. A woman who had a heart condition and her doctor wouldn't agree for her leaving her home. A young man with PTSD who wouldn't leave his parents' basement. So we've been doing things like this for quite some time, as well as treatment. And I think other folks had as well. Obviously, things shifted significantly with COVID.
Were there any guidelines in place before COVID started, before your working group struck up, that assisted people do virtual assessments and treatment?
I'm not aware of anything specifically, no.
All right. Now, you struck up the working group with other psychologists. I think you were asked by the Ontario Psychological Association to do so. Maybe you can tell us, generally how the group was struck up, how it worked, and the conclusions that you worked towards.
Well, the Ontario Psychological Association and Canadian Academy of Psychologists and Disability Assessment basically formed a committee of psychologists and neuropsychologists to address the various areas that would be affected by doing these virtual assessments. And they brought us together to look at the research in our areas. We had Zoom meetings, virtual meetings to discuss these things and to review our work as we pulled together guidelines.
Well, let's get to it, Dr. Levitt. Maybe you can tell us at first, what were the conclusions reached by the working group? Let's start with virtual assessments. Do they work?
I love that question. They do absolutely work.
How do you know?
Well, the research has actually been quite favorable. So aside from just our personal experiences of it working and patients saying they actually appreciate this format, the research is quite favorable in terms of the equivalence, say, for example, of psychological and neuropsychological tests, whether it's in person or remote, and the equivalence of diagnostic interviewing, in person and remote. So we already know that it's working quite well.
When I reviewed the guidelines that were put out by your working group, I noticed that there were a number of studies that were cited in this regard. The bottom line, these studies that were conducted, do they say that virtual assessments can be relied on?
Yeah, the bottom line is that that the assessments can be relied upon. The issue is each assessment, the psychologist following a rigorous method, as we always would, whether it's in person or virtual, and that with our method basically results in an assessment that can be relied upon, whether in person or virtual.
Okay, let's talk about the pros. What are the pros of doing a virtual assessment?
Some of the obvious pros I think already came up in your introduction, which is that patients who normally couldn't access these easily now can access them far more easily. Patients with pain conditions who would have a difficult time traveling a long distance to do in-person assessments now can do these assessments in a much more comfortable way. That's an important pro for sure. I find from a psychological perspective, the ability to really focus in on someone's face, which tells me so much. And also seeing someone in their home environment. I see things that I would have never seen when they come into the clinic. So there are a number of pros that way as well.
Okay, is it different between assessment and treatment or similar in terms of pros?
Assessment for treatment and assessment for legal purposes, I think that the pros would be quite similar. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's dig a little deeper here. What are some of the pitfalls? What are some of the cons of conducting a virtual assessment?
I guess the way that I see this, and based on the committee work, is that I would see them more as challenges than cons, because I don't think there's any reason to think that a virtual assessment is in any way less than an in-person assessment. They're just different. So we apply our assessment in a different way. The challenges come in making sure that patients are able to use technology and having practice sessions, for example, to make sure that they're able to do this. Also challenges with respect to privacy, making sure that the patient's in an environment where they are truly private and don't feel like, for example, family members are overhearing them. So I think those are challenges that the guidelines address in terms of us making sure we pay attention to those things.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I read the guidelines myself, and I found it quite interesting that there were sample consent forms for virtual treatment and assessment. There was also sample forms to speak about privacy and some suggestions there. So let's talk about the medical legal context.
Okay.
If you were preparing a psychological assessment for a med-legal, be it defendant or plaintiff, what are some of the things you should be mindful of? Is this even a good idea at all?
Well, let's start with, is it a good idea at all? Yes. I think that's, for me, that's pretty simple. The psychological assessment method, because we gather information from multiple different sources, whether it's testing, interviewing, the file, it's quite flexible in being able to use this, whether it's in person or remote. In terms of considerations for a legal assessment, at the end of the day, I think we all have to be aware that we could be called to testify and be cross-examined. It's a part of the work we're doing. Anyone who's coming here today to your webinar should be aware of that. So that in our reports, we have to be very mindful and explain how we did our assessment. And if we feel that there were any limits to our ability to come to our conclusions, we have to be able to state that openly in our reports and be comfortable in being cross-examined about that.
Okay, so give me an example of what limits there might be. When would you say, okay, I better write something in my report evidencing or explaining why I did it this way?
Well, first of all, I would always explain in a report how I went about the assessment. So if the interviews were through an online platform like this, I would openly state that. If testing was done on an online platform, I would openly state that, and we explain our process in terms of the proctoring, et cetera. In terms of limitations, and this is something that comes up not just in remote, but also in person. So for example, with in-person assessments, we may see someone who doesn't speak English. Using an interpreter for testing or for interviewing is something that could affect our data. And for example, with folks who don't speak English, the testing likely wouldn't be normed for them, and we have to state that. It's the same kind of situation with a virtual. If any kind of limiting factor were to come up, we would basically explain that and why we weigh some data more strongly than other data that we have.
Mm-hmm.
It's assessment by assessment.
Is there some assessment that you would be afraid to do virtually? Is there some place where you draw the line and say, you know what, I just can't do a virtual assessment on this person?
With the work that I do, I would say no. I've not encountered that yet. I'm not saying it won't happen, but I haven't encountered that yet. I've been doing this under COVID since March of last year, and have not had a single situation. Now, I think that there are folks, for example, who do child psychology who have some unique challenges that could speak better to whether or not it would work well for them in some contexts. And that's not my area though, so I shouldn't comment.
If you're dealing with, let's say, a chronic pain case where there's no objective evidence of injury and someone's failed all the validity tests at a previous assessment, is that the kind of situation where you might want to see the person in person instead of virtually?
I don't see how seeing the person in person versus virtually for the clinical interview would necessarily address the challenge of the case that you're talking about, right? I mean, in person we have the same challenge of having the invalid test data and a pain condition that can't be x-rayed, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Right. So, but I don't see any limitation to doing diagnostic interviewing virtually compared to in person, and the research backs that up.
Yeah, I just want to circle back in terms of that sort of validity testing that you may want to conduct in that case. Can that be done virtually? Are there any limitations to that?
Well, again, the research is showing that there's good equivalence with tests. So with cognitive tests, and neuropsychologists would speak to this better than I would. There's good equivalence with cognitive tests, and we're also doing tests with symptom validity measures. I think that's what you're referring to, online. And early on, the test publishers have been open to us doing that. So far, I haven't come across limitations in that sense that wouldn't also be challenges in person.
Now, I know you're not a neuropsychologist, but I promised the folks who signed up today that I'd answer the question regarding whether or not a person must attend med legal exams for defendants or in the accident benefit context during COVID. And there was a recent decision that came out regarding this. And it related to a case that was supposed to go to trial this June, or I guess it should be starting June 2nd, except there are no jury trials starting June 2nd. But back when the decision came out, they hoped that there would be a trial. And the defendants very much wanted to conduct their med legal exams before that trial. And they wanted 2 exams. One was with a physiatrist and one was with a neuropsychologist. With respect to the physiatrist said, this is a physical exam. I simply can't do it virtually, and the court easily accepted that. But with respect to the neuropsychological assessment, there was evidence back and forth whether it was needed or not to be live. And I just want to read you a paragraph from the conclusion of this case. The master in this case, which is one step below a judge, said, the neuropsychologist testified, quote, I cannot conduct a neuropsych assessment virtually. Administration of cognitive testing must be done face-to-face using the required stimulus materials. And that was the end of the quote from the neuropsychologist's evidence. The master then went on to say, for the reasons noted above in relation to the physiatry assessment, I am satisfied that the neuropsychology examination must also be conducted in person. Tell me, Dr. Levitt, based on your work with the OPA and the working group on remote assessments, is it the consensus view of neuropsychologists that a neuropsychological exam must be conducted in person?
It's actually not the view at all, and that's what the guidelines support. And I believe the guidelines were out before this case that you're referencing. So the guidelines basically and the research that is continuing to come out show that these absolutely can be done, and that there's good equivalence with the cognitive tests. So from a clinical perspective, that would appear to be wrong.
From my review of the case law, the courts are very hesitant to prevent or not order that at least part of the exam be live if needed. There were previous cases where the judge wanted the defense medical experts to do what they could virtually until the pandemic's over, and then if needed later, do a live assessment. I can tell everyone out there that the courts are leaning towards ordering people to have live assessments if there's evidence that the physician or psychologist want it to be live. This is obviously going to be emerging. I think a big part of having the court accept virtual assessments in whole has somewhat to do with the familiarity of the judiciary using this equipment. Any thoughts on that, Dr. Levitt?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things come to mind when you're talking about using something that people may be unfamiliar with. And I think that's a really important point, is that being unfamiliar doesn't make it an approach that's less than in person. I would say that if a neuropsychologist or psychologist does not have experience doing it this way, that would be potentially a concern. And that they should seek out experience doing virtual assessment, so that if they're called to do one, they can do it virtually. Now, if they don't have the experience, then they're in a bind in terms of being able to do it virtually, right? So it may be that in this case that you're referencing, that the neuropsychologist didn't have the experience doing it virtually. And in that case, it would be fair to say, I can't do it. However, someone who can do it virtually probably should be asked to do it.
Well, those are my questions for you today, Dr. Levitt. I thought that was very interesting and informative. Maybe we can turn now to some of the questions and see what people out there are thinking.
Sure. I'll start with the first question. Do I need to record all my virtual interactions, assessment or treatment session, as proof of the delivery of my service?
I'm definitely want to pass that one to Dr. Levitt to answer.
Uh, I, we never had to do that in person to prove that we delivered a service. I don't see that being any different for a virtual assessment. I take clinical notes when I do an assessment for any purpose. And those clinical notes in court have always served as a reasonable source of information showing that I really saw the person.
Just to jump one point from a legal perspective, I do think that if you're recording the sessions, I think at a minimum you should get some sort of consent from the patient or whoever's assessed before you do that.
Absolutely.
And on that note, that leads really well into the next question. Do we have access to wording for consent forms in virtual care, so sample forms?
Yeah, I recall Dr. Levitt seeing something in the guidelines itself, like a template for that, but do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I know at least for psychology, and I think there are health professionals from a number of professions here today, but at least for the guidelines we have in psychology, we do have templates or suggested wording that helps to address the concerns one might have with consent for this format. So if other professions don't have that, they might look at what we've done with psychology and have their professional bodies put something together appropriate for what they do.
I took a review in Ontario of the other professional bodies, such as social workers or OTs, regarding guidelines for these assessments. I think for social work and OT, their colleges did put out some information from their colleges' websites about this, not nearly as comprehensive as the psychologists have so far. But for those OTs and social workers, and I think even physiotherapists out there, I do think their colleges on their websites have some information, although it's not nearly as comprehensive.
Good.
This question is for Dr. Levitt. When doing virtual assessment, are you able to apply the standardized test results when they are based on in-person validity and reliability measures?
Ooh, that sounds like a tough one, Dr. Levitt.
So yeah, we're able to use both symptom validity tests, performance validity tests, symptom measures, cognitive measures. Again, there is good research out there showing that that it's reasonable to do this. Right. Again, it comes down to saying how we did the assessment, and if we have a concern over the results of the data we gathered.
From when I read the working group report, it seemed to me that there were some studies done that spoke of, doing testing live and virtual, and then comparing the results in that regard and seeing if it was different. And I think, wasn't it very much the same?
Again, the equivalence data is quite good. We're gathering our own normative data within our clinic. I think other practices are likely doing that as well. Which becomes another another check on the norms that we use. But again, so far to this point, I'm not seeing any reason to be hesitant to do a virtual assessment.
I mean, I know this is now getting a little deeper into this subject, but sir, I know psychologists use tests, written tests, to reach certain conclusions or to gather more data. Are there certain tests that just don't work virtually, or alternatively, certain tests that work even better on virtual?
Yeah, both questions are quite interesting to me. So I think I would turn to my neuropsych colleagues with respect to tests that might not work as well in this format, and perhaps also assessment with children that perhaps certain tests may not. Not my area. Interestingly, I think that there's support out there that when people are doing virtual assessment, they're actually more engaged in the process, which I think is fascinating and consistent with my experience. That when we're engaged over this virtual format, it seems that that patients are more engaged. And we've had assessments, for example, where patients were failing performance validity measures in previous neuropsych assessments in person with other assessors, and scoring perfectly on remote performance validity measures when we did the assessments, suggesting perhaps that they engage much better in this format.
Interesting.
And that leads quite well into another question. Much of the neuropsych testing is a standardized paper pencil process. How are these tests being administered virtually, or are assessors using other means of data collection?
I'm not sure I exactly understand the question, except that I do know that, for example, there are a number of tests that have been adapted for virtual use in terms of, say, having a laptop or iPad set up with the patient and a laptop or iPad used with the psychometrist, and being able to present the stimuli and record the data as the assessment proceeds. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the question or not.
All right, someone else wants to know, because we're doing virtual assessments, does that mean that we can provide treatment or assessment to clients who are traveling from somewhere outside of Ontario?
Well, if I can jump in on that one, Dr. Levitt, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah.
This is a fascinating, and this topic deserves its whole own seminar, to be fair. I really do see a world where Ontario psychologists are providing treatment for people in British Columbia or the Northwest Territories at some point. And it makes you wonder, in a system that is regulated province by province or territory by territory, how is this going to work? And I would say right now they're still trying to figure that out. But the bottom line right now is this. If you're in Ontario and you're treating someone in another province, you better make sure that you're complying with the regulatory body in that province and the province that you're in. So you have to comply with both bodies. I think also you need to tell the person where you are when you're conducting this assessment. You can't leave that to their imagination. There are other rules too. Also, there are other issues as well. They go on and on and on, this idea of inter-jurisdictional treatment. This is equally true for occupational therapists and social workers. But the bottom line is, if you're treating someone in another place, make sure you understand the other provinces or territories' regulatory guidelines. In each province, they have unique needs or unique things that they want the psychologist to have. For instance, insurance. Maybe certain credentials. If you're treating someone somewhere else, be careful. Make sure that you're complying with the regulatory body in place.
Great, thanks, Michael.
So I would have to imagine that this is only a matter of time before Ontario psychologists are treating people in Alberta or Nova Scotia or elsewhere. But we're not there yet, and be careful.
Okay, next question. What do you do when an opposing party opinion is firm to virtual assessment not working? Are there any supported documents that can be provided to them?
Well, let me begin by saying that they should closely review the version 1 of the guideline, because if you review it closely, you'll see that it's evidentiary based. It's prepared by a wide range of psychologists who practice in different areas and who are known to be more defense-minded, some more plaintiff-minded, and some middle of the road. It's a fair representation of psychologists in this province. And I would suggest that if counsel out there want to force a court to have the assessment virtual, then perhaps they should speak to someone, a member of the panel, have them swear an affidavit and attach the guidelines and see what a judge or master says about that. I can't confirm exactly what they'll say, but I do think that this document is quite compelling.
When performing virtual assessments, are electronic signatures good enough for both OCF-18s or consent forms?
Any thoughts on that, Dr. Levitt?
Yeah, We have been using electronic signatures. That's been accepted by the insurers. We've used electronic signatures on reports actually ourselves for years for our in-person work, and that's been accepted. And I've never had a problem in court or in arbitration having had my electronic signature put on a report, for example. So similar issue.
When doing virtual assessments, can we share the screen of tests when we're doing the testing?
Dr. Levitt.
So the share screen function, you're saying, like if there's using the stimuli or the response booklet, in terms of the technological aspects of things like share screen, I leave that to my trained staff who are better at doing that. So they've had no issues with it.
This one's for Michael.
Let's make this the last question, though, because I think we're running out of time.
Sure. So Michael, someone's just asked if you could provide the case law that you were referring to.
Oh, the case is called Majewski and Brook. And it came out in March of 2021. Majewski is Mierzejewski and Brook, Brook.
Great. Thanks.
So
Michael.
I just well, thank everyone for coming, and I'll pass it back to you. So I think that we have some business to attend to here.
That's right. For everyone that still has a question they'd like answered, I'd encourage you to reach out to Michael, and he'll do his best to answer the questions or potentially.
I'll email Dr. Levitt and see what happens with your question.
We'll now draw one lucky winner for the everything card. Michael, can you pick out a number for me?
Now, I know this is why everyone's here, the big draw. I'm closing my eyes and putting it in the bag, and it is number 82.
82. So that is Beth Dick at Pursuit Health Management. Congratulations.
Well, congratulations, Beth. And I'm sure someone from Thomson Rogers will be in touch with you about this.
Absolutely. Make sure to keep your eye out for an email from the everything card. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Be sure to look out for the next Thomson Rogers webinar session on June 24th. More information about this will be provided on our website.
All right, thank you, Dr. Levitt. We really appreciate you coming today.
I appreciate you inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.